to look at the first topic in company law, known as nature and classification of companies, nature and classification of companies. So basically, it's just an introduction about what is actually a company. So you need to be able to know what is a company. Then you are supposed to be able to know the characteristics of a company, Then you are supposed to actually also know about the types of a company, types of companies. Then know about the principle of separate legal entity, the principle of separate legal entity. Then be able to know about the distinction between a company and other forms of business So these are the key areas under the first topic of company law. So you're basically saying you're supposed to be able to know what is a company. What exactly do you mean by a company? Then characteristics of a company, then the types of companies, then the principle of separate legal entity, then the distinction between a company and other forms of business. So basically, you're saying this is actually the first topic under company law. So generally, we are talking about company law. So you can see we have company, then we basically have what is actually law. So when you talk about a company, so the first thing to be able to know that a company is actually a form of business. It is a form of business or a means through which a person, or you can say a means through which a person can actually be able to carry out business. It's a form in which a person can actually be able to basically carry out the aspect of maybe selling of goods or services. So of course, when you talk about a form of business, then what should actually come to your mind then basically is that we have other forms of business, like for example, partnerships, like for example, sole proprietorships, like for example, you can actually be able to talk about cooperative societies. So company is just one of those forms of business. So when you talk about a company, it's basically an association of persons coming together and being able to put together their skills, abilities, or maybe talents, so that they can actually be able to provide goods or services to consumers. And mostly, it is actually for them to be able to make what is known as profits. So it's basically an association of persons coming together, putting together their abilities. When we talk about abilities, in this case, we're talking about abilities in terms of maybe resources, like for example, being able to raise capital and being able to basically provide goods and services to consumers at actually what is known as a profit. So when you talk about company law, then of course you have here law. We're basically talking about rules and regulations that are actually guiding on how basically companies can actually be able to carry out their activities as a form of business. So under company law, basically we are looking at rules and regulations that actually govern operations of companies. And a company, you are saying it's actually a form of business. And this form of business is basically where persons are coming together, putting together their abilities, maybe talents or maybe skills, to be able to provide goods or services to consumers. And mostly this is actually done for them to be able to make what is known as a profit. Because in any business, then of course the key thing is actually maybe to make a profit for the owner of a business, for the owner of the business. So when you talk about a company, so a company is one of the form of business which is actually very unique, and most people will basically prefer to be able to carry out their business mostly as a company, other than the other forms of business that you have actually been able to mention. So because we are saying we have other forms of business like sole proprietorships. We can have, for example, maybe partnerships. partnerships, or we can have, for example, maybe cooperative societies, for example, cooperative societies. So when you talk about a company, so it has very unique characteristics. For example, you realize that a company as a form of business, the first key thing is that it is a separate legal entity. So this is characteristic number one. It is a separate legal entity. You can actually also be able to talk about is that can own property. It can own property in its own name. So it can actually be able to own property in its own name. It can own property in its own name. Then you can actually also be able to talk about it can sue or be sued in its own name. So that is another characteristic that we can actually be able to talk about. We can actually be able to talk about is that it has a perpetual succession. It has perpetual succession. So there's perpetual succession in companies. That one will be able to explain what we mean by that. You can actually be able to talk about can have what is known as a limited liability. It can have what is known as a limited liability. We can actually also be able to talk about a company being able to be seen as an artificial person, being able to be seen as an artificial person. So when you talk about a company being a separate legal entity, we mean that the company, so the company itself and the owners are actually two distinct parties. So they're actually two distinct parties. So the company itself and the owners are not like one and the same person. So this one is basically explained by a rule known as the Solomon versus Solomon and Company Limited. So this is a case law or a famous case law that basically tries to explain that a company itself as a form of business and the owners are actually two different or distinct entities. So these particular characteristics, you realize that it does not actually exist in these other forms of business. Like for example, if you look at a form of business like a sole proprietor, the owner and the business itself, they're just viewed as actually being one and the same person. But of course, you are saying under company, you'll see that the company itself and the owners are actually two different persons. And even you can actually be able to see that you are saying a company itself will be viewed under the law as being a distinct person from the owner, such that it is an artificial person that is created by an aspect of actually being able to register the company. So when you talk about a separate legal entity, then it is viewed under the law as actually being a separate or a distinct person from the owners of the company, from the owners of the company. So saying it is explained by this particular case law. When you talk about a case law, it's just basically a ruling that was actually made by a judge that has actually set a precedence. So any ruling that is made in relation to that particular ruling, then of course this one will be the reference for any ruling that will be made in relation to basically being able to determine whether a company is actually distinct from the owners. So under this particular case law, then we are talking about this person known as Solomon actually having a business or operating a business as a sole owner. So the business was actually being operated as a sole proprietorship, but eventually he decided to basically incorporate the business or basically form a company known as Solomon and Company Limited and basically transferred the business to the company. So it was a boot manufacturing business that was actually being owned by Solomon as a sole owner. But of course, the relatives, in this case, the sons, the daughters, and of course, the wife were actually interested in the business. So for them to be able to join the business, he had to incorporate or basically register a company. And of course, all of them, Solomon together with the sons and the wife, they of course became the shareholders of Solomon and Company Limited. So as a result of him actually being able to transfer the business to Salomon and Company Limited, then he was actually given the highest stake in the business, such that he was actually allowed to basically own what is known as 10,000 debentures. 10,000 debentures in the business, 10,000 debentures in the business. So in this case, it basically means that he had actually, of course, like basically lent an amount equivalent to the business he transferred to Salomon and Company Limited. So it basically means that he had a stake in the business worth 10,000 debentures. He was actually entitled to earn interest in this Salomon and Company Limited. So he was entitled to earn interest in Salomon and Company Limited. So this means that since he had a stake, he could actually rank as one of the creditors of the company in case the life of the company had to come to an end. So this is what actually happened. This particular company, known as Salomon and Company Limited, actually faced financial difficulties, and it was actually liquidated, or its life was forced to come to an end. Its life was actually forced to come to an end. So as a result of that, this particular person, known as Salomon, was actually supposed to rank as one of the creditors of the company, having been given what is known as 10,000 debentures as a result of transferring his own business to the company. So it's like he had actually lent an equivalent amount, or what equivalent amount of the business, to Salomon and Company Limited. So he was given 10,000 debentures in the company. Therefore, he was entitled to earn interest. And in case the company is actually liquidated, he's supposed to be paid the amount he had actually given to the company in form of transferring the business to the company. But of course, the other creditors of the company actually claimed that Salomon and Company Limited are just like one and the same person. So therefore, he's not entitled to the amount or equivalent to his business that he had actually transferred to the company. So this went to a court of law, and basically the judge ruled and actually stated that Salomon and Company Limited are actually two different persons. So they are not one and the same person. So this basically means that a company and the owners, even though Salomon was actually one of the owners of the company as a result of being one of the shareholders of the company, or majority shareholders of the company, it doesn't mean that Salomon and Company Limited are actually one and the same person. So this basically led to the conclusion that a company is actually a separate legal entity. So a company is actually a separate legal entity. So this means that a company and the owners should actually obviously be viewed as two different persons, or actually two distinct persons. So as a result of this basically now a company is viewed as actually being a very unique form of business, even when compared to the other forms of business like a sole proprietorship, or maybe a partnership, or maybe sole proprietorship, or maybe a partnerships. Because if you look at a sole proprietor or how it actually operates, then the sole proprietor and the owner are just like one and the same person. So there's no principle of separate legal entity under a sole proprietor or a partnership. So in a partnership, basically it means that this is a form of business whereby we have partners. So the partnership and the partners themselves are not actually distinct from the partnership as a form of business. So that's why most people will basically now prefer to basically operate as a company other than actually operating as any other form of business. Then of course you are actually also saying it can actually own property in its own name. So it basically means that once the company is actually registered, or is actually formed, any property can actually be registered in the name of the company and not in the name of the owners. It basically means that, for example, if we have a company like Safaricom, whereby we have the shareholders, any properties acquired by Safaricom will basically be registered in the name of Safaricom as a company and not in the name of all the shareholders of the company. So it has this particular characteristic whereby it can actually be able to own property in its own name. So that is basically what we mean by a company being able to own property in its own name. For example, acquiring land and the title deed is registered in the name of the company. Then we are talking about the company being able to sue or be sued in its own name. So it basically means that any person can bring an action before a court of law in the name of the company, or the company could decide to basically bring any action against any other person in a court of law in its own name and not in the name of the owners or the shareholders. So this basically means that the company itself can actually be able to go to a court of law and register any case, or basically bring a case in a court of law in its own name and not in the name of the owners of the company. So this particular characteristic is not actually basically realized, for example, under a form of business like a sole proprietor or maybe a partnership. Because if you look at a sole proprietor, any action in a court of law or any case that is actually brought by the sole proprietorship in a court of law, it will likely be in the name of the sole owner of the business, in the name of the sole owner of the business. If it is a partnership, it will be in the name of all the partners in that particular partnership. So that's why you are saying a company can actually be able to basically bring any action in a court of law in its own name, or sue anyone in a court of law in its own name, or any person can actually be able to sue the company in the name of the company. So he brings an action in the name of the company and not in the name of the owners of the company. Then we are saying it has a perpetual succession. Sometimes they say it has a permanent existence. This basically means that a company can actually exist for a very long period of time without its life coming to an end. That's why we see certain companies have actually existed for almost over a century, or maybe even 200 years, and they're actually still in existence. So this basically means that a company its life can actually only come to an end, maybe, of course, if it faces maybe financial difficulties, or maybe if the members themselves, or maybe the shareholders decide that the life of the company should come to an end. So for example, if you look at a company like Coca-Cola, it has actually been there for over a century, and it is actually still in existence. So people are actually still consuming the products of Coca-Cola. So this basically means that its life cannot actually easily come to an end, unless maybe it faces financial difficulties, or maybe people are not actually interested in its products. That's when its life can actually come to an end. So a company can exist for forever. That's why we are saying it has a perpetual succession. So you can have owners right now. Maybe after 100 years, we'll have new owners, and the life of the company can actually be able to go on. If you look at companies like, for example, Bata. So Bata has been there for almost 150 years, and it's actually still in existence. So the founder, Bata, is no longer there, but the life of the company is actually still continuing. So that's why we say a company can actually be able to have a perpetual succession, or sometimes they say a permanent existence. Then limited liability. When you talk about a limited liability, then it basically means that in a company, the liability of the members, how far the liability of the owner of the company can actually be limited. So if you look at, for example, a form of business like a sole proprietor, or maybe like a small kiosk, the owner of a small kiosk who is actually operating in your neighborhood, you realize that the liabilities of the business are like those of the owner of the kiosk. But in a company, we can actually be able to have a company being able to have what is known as a limited liability, such that the liabilities of the owners of the business are actually up to a certain extent. They're actually limited. For example, we could actually talk about this liability actually being limited up to the amount you've guaranteed to contribute in case the company is actually liquidated or its life is come to an end. For example, if you guarantee to basically give, like, for example, 10,000, then your liability, how far you're actually liable in the company, will actually be up to maybe 10,000. So, but for example, if you look at maybe a partnership, so the liability is not actually limited. And in case the business itself has liabilities, for example, it has a bank loan, and the business cannot actually be able to sustain the payment of the bank loan, then of course the owner of the business is the one who will likely be liable to pay for the bank loan. So the liabilities of the business are like those of the owner of the business. So in the case of a company, then of course it can actually have what is known as a limited liability, such that the liabilities of the owners are actually limited up to a certain extent. So it's not, this is not actually realized, for example, in the case of a business like a sole proprietor or maybe a partnership, a sole proprietor or maybe a partnership. Then an artificial person. So it basically means that a company is viewed under the law as actually being a person who has actually been created artificially through the process known as actually formation, or basically you can actually say incorporation of the company. So the company will actually be registered artificially and become an artificial person, and viewed under the law as actually being a person, being able maybe to maybe carry out maybe acquisition of properties, being able to be sued in its own name, having a perpetual succession. So it is viewed under the law as actually being an artificial person. So apart from these ones, then you can actually also be able to talk about other characteristics such as a company having what is known as a residence, a company having what is known as a residence, a company having what is known as a common sale, a company having what is known as a common sale. So when you say a residence, then basically any person seeking to basically form a company must clearly outline where the company's residence is. So residence is actually very important in case they are supposed to maybe determine where exactly the company is actually supposed to be taxed. For example, if the residence of that particular company is actually in Kenya, it basically means that the company should actually be taxed in Kenya. So these are characteristics that each and every company will actually have, or basically state what is its residence. For example, the residence of the company is actually maybe in Nakuru at a certain building, maybe 6th floor, room number this. So that is the residence of the company. And you're saying it is quite important because this one will actually be able to help determine exactly where the company is actually supposed to be taxed. So if the residence of the company is actually in Kenya, it basically means that the company should actually be taxed in Kenya. So any person seeking to incorporate a company or basically register a company will basically clearly outline what is the residence of the company. Then a common sale is basically enables the company to authenticate any document originating from the company. It basically means that it's like an identifier of anything originating from the company, such that to show that this particular document maybe originated from the company, like an invoice, is actually authentic, or maybe it has actually been approved by the company. So this is very important because the company, because it is actually an artificial person, it cannot actually be able to maybe sign documents by itself because it is a man-made person. It's not like a natural person who's actually able to sign his own documents by using his unique signature. So the company does not actually have a signature because it is actually an artificial person. So therefore, to authenticate any document originating from the company, therefore what is supposed to be used and what is recognized under the law is known as a common sale. But in certain places, some people use what is known as a stamp. So that's why maybe a receipt originating from any company, for it to be authentic, it has to be stamped. So this is common sale is the one that is actually maybe commonly recognized under those, that the company should actually have what is known as a common sale to authenticate any document originating from the company, to authenticate any document originating from the company. So these are among the key characteristics of a company as a form of business. So if you look at most of these particular characteristics, then you realize that these particular characteristics are not realized in the other forms of business, like a sole proprietor or maybe a partnership. So that's why maybe a company can actually be the most preferable form of business to be able to use to carry out business, like for example, sale of services or maybe sale of goods, with an aim of actually being able to realize what is known as profit, profit. So that's all about a brief introduction about what is actually a company, or with regard to what you are supposed to study under company law, and being able to know exactly what is actually a company and what are its key characteristics and what are actually its key characteristics. So we're saying basically, generally under company law, we are looking at rules and regulations governing operations of companies. And in this case, we are mostly interested with rules that actually govern operations of companies in Kenya. So the law that is basically regulating operations of companies in Kenya is actually the Companies Act of 2015. Companies Act of 2015. So our basis will basically be able to understand exactly what are the requirements under the Companies Act and any other relevant rules and regulations governing operations of companies. And in our study, basically we make references to what are known as case laws. For example, what you just made reference to what is known as Salomon versus Salmon and Company Limited is a case law. When we say a case law, is basically a ruling that was actually basically made by a judge long time ago that has actually set a precedence, and any person who basically wants to make any reference, then of course can actually be able to make a reference to that particular ruling that was actually made. For example, this one is basically trying to explain that a company is actually a separate legal entity from the owners. A company is a separate legal entity from the owners. So I think that is what we are supposed to be able to know about the introduction and what are the characteristics of a company. So that is the end of this particular session, or actually video. And in our next one, we'll be able to look at what are the types of companies, what are the types of companies. Then later on, we'll be able to look at the principle of separate legal entity, the principle of separate legal entity, or the rule, the case law of Salmon versus Salmon and Company Limited. What are actually its exceptions? And later on, we'll actually be able to also look at the distinction between companies and the other forms of business we've just looked at. For example, sole proprietor, for example, partnerships, for example, cooperative societies. So until we meet then, thank you for having you in this particular session. Thank you for having you in this particular session. Thank you for having you in this particular